Okay, so here we have the dates listed for. Here we have the dates for the three-part webinar series. One thing to note here is that if you click on the hyperlink, it will take you to the page on the OSSE website where the recording lives and where the PowerPoint lives for each of these webinars. The first part focused on assessment accommodations for students with disabilities on the 27th. Today we're going to dive deep into accommodations for English language learners, and part 3 will take place on Monday the 29th, and if you click this link, you will be able to register for that webinar. In that webinar, we're going to be more focused on the technical aspects of implementing accommodations for students with disabilities and for second language learners. The purpose of this webinar is to review the available testing accommodations and accessibility features and to sort of highlight the distinction between those two terms and what they mean for statewide assessments, to clarify documentation requirements for the use of accommodations and features by English learners, to showcase resources available to assist you in selecting, registering, and implementing accommodations, and to briefly review the student registration and personal needs profile for ELLs. One thing to note about this webinar is that if you've attended the test coordinator training, some of the information is going to be familiar to you. So this is reviewing that. And I also want to mention that I'm going to make reference to a couple of key things that need to be noted for WIDA Access for ELLs 2.0. There are deadlines coming up, and I just wanted to bring your attention to them. However, the focus of this presentation is on accommodations for our content-specific statewide assessments. And by that I mean PARCC Math, PARCC English Language Arts Literacy, and DC Science. I would also like to encourage you to, if and when you have questions, please write in the chat box or the questions box or feature on the online. I'm going to provide an overview of accommodations and accessibility features. I think that many of us, all of us, know that it's very important to ensure accessibility to all assessments for all students, particularly those who need them. And when doing so, there are sort of 5 focuses that we should have. And this sort of outlines the trajectory of thinking about how do we choose and select accommodations for students. So we start with an expectation that they're going to achieve grade level and course academic content standards, that they need to know, and they being your students as well as you, learning about the different features and accommodations that are available, then selecting the ones that are appropriate, and then administering them during the assessment and evaluating and improving accessibility features and accommodations use after they've been implemented. The term special populations is a legal one that covers a wide range of communities, but here at OSSE, we use it to refer to 4 distinct groups of students who may receive accommodations on statewide assessments. Today, I'm going to focus on the students who are English learners and students who are English learners with disabilities who have an IEP or a 504 plan, because those students are eligible to receive both sets of accommodations. This slide shows DC content-specific statewide assessments. Wanted to provide a 50,000 feet view anyway of assessments here in DC. So this provides you with an understanding of what the assessment is, some history associated with that, and the grade level of students who are assessed by those assessments. This webinar is based on the part 2 of the Testing Accommodations Manual for this school year. We deliberately split the manuals in 2 parts. The first part, which took place on the 27th of January, was focused on students with disabilities, and part 2 today, and this was released at the beginning of the month, end of January, beginning of February. And part 2 of the manual focused on ELLs, and that's what we'll be talking about today, and accommodations for them on statewide assessments. And in the manual, there's a crosswalk between the content-specific statewide assessments. One, I will put a plug here, a crosswalk between the accommodations available for the content-specific statewide assessments to WIDA access for ELLs 2.0 is forthcoming, should be available within the next couple of weeks. When taking a closer look at the PARCC assessments, it's helpful to understand how accommodations are divvied up. If there is a student who needs to have a certain accessibility feature available to them because of their disability, legally, this is called an accommodation. And they can have an accommodation even if they don't have a disability, and that's what we're focusing on. And these accommodations listed either in the student's ELL plan, IEP, or 504 plan must be provided to students. I start with this point simply to distinguish between PARCC's accessibility features and accommodation features. So accessibility features built into the testing system increase access to test content for all students and can be accessed at any time. PARCC has 2 kinds of accommodations that they call accessibility features. Some are built into the test and automatically available at any time. For example, a highlighter tool. Other features are a little more technologically advanced and have to be activated in the system ahead of time. Or it might be an administrative consideration, which has nothing to do with the technological aspects. I'll give a couple of examples of these shortly. Lastly, PARCC calls the third group of these actual accommodations because they do not make them available to all students. The ones I'm going to talk about today are those available only for students who are English language learners, or students who are English language learners and students with disabilities documented on a 504 plan or an IEP. So to drive home the point, if a student is an ELL and qualifies for one of these accessibility features, they have access to it like all students. And if they need an accommodation that's specific to them and appropriate for their level of English language proficiency, then they must be provided the accommodation. So let's look at a couple of examples of these different categories according to PARCC. With these accessibility features for all students, examples include a pop-up glossary, a line reader tool, or highlighters in enlarged font. Here are a few more accommodations that PARCC calls accessibility features. I'm not going to focus on these. In the third slide here, in the third bullet, I just want to say that these extended time, human signer for test direction, Braille test booklet, that applies to students who have those documented on their IEP and 504. And I'll mention specifically the accommodations for English learners. So word-to-word dictionary and translation of math to Spanish. These are just some examples. This is not a comprehensive list, but I did want to sort of explain what these features are, because there are 3, each of these categories here in the bubble correlate to 3 main buckets that we talk about when we mention accommodations and accessibility features. So the first, in purple, is accessibility features for all students. These features are embedded in the PARCC online delivery system, or Pearson Access Next, which we'll show you shortly. The second bucket, in blue, relates to accessibility features that must be identified in advance as indicated in their personal needs profile. And the third bucket relates to supports only for students who are actually English language learners and who have a 504 plan or an IEP. Here I want to mention that the DC Science Assessment, to not focus exclusively on PARCC, the DC Science Assessment uses an identical assessment platform and registration system as PARCC. It's called Pearson Access Next and TestNav 8. And I want to call attention to the fact that DC Science is only available in English. There are, unlike PARCC, there isn't an adaptation in Spanish available. And if a student needs clarification in language other than English, similar to some of the guidance that we provide around PARCC, and the student for DC Science is not allowed to receive translations that are ad hoc. And I can go a little bit more into detail about that, but I just wanted to call attention to the fact that it is an English-only assessment, and it must be administered in English without any translations. There is a crosswalk to be used to look at science accommodations in conjunction with PARCC, and that's for all students who need an accommodation, whether they are a student with disability or they're an English language learner. I'm going to transition to talk about some considerations to keep in mind when selecting accommodations for English language learners. Many of you probably are familiar with this graphic here. In part 2 of the accommodations manual, I have this here in a table, and what it refers to is the 6 levels associated with access for ELLs, and these levels correlate to a composite score for English language proficiency. So WIDA, the consortium, breaks this out according to entering, emerging, developing, expanding, bridging, and advanced. What you see in the PARCC definition side is a correlation of that WIDA composite score to a PARCC definition of what they consider beginning, intermediate, and advanced. And what I want to call attention to this sort of consideration around a student's English language proficiency level, because that will affect whether or not you provide some of the accommodations we're going to talk about here pretty shortly. And there are 3 main factors to consider when deciding on whether or not a student who is an English language learner should receive an accommodation. You should first take into account the student's English language proficiency level. Really examine the student's literacy in his or her native language, and their biliteracy or multiliteracy, and their background, such as their grade and age, time in English-speaking schools, comfort with the assessments, comfort testing in English. All of those things are going to provide a more comprehensive picture around which accommodation is appropriate. I've received several questions about the Testing Accommodations Manual Part 2, and particularly a chart that I have in there that provides some recommendations around for which levels of students certain accommodations are appropriate for. I want to take a moment and say that those are suggestions. They're not hard and fast rules. I would say, even though this is not very specific, I would say that these 3 main factors are what you use to determine whether or not an accommodation for your student who has ELL status, what they qualify for. There are other considerations like time, space and equipment, people that affect this puzzle of accommodations. I want to point to the fact of time. For PARCC, we have 3 test window options. DCPS their test window is starting April 11th. When thinking about accommodations, some are very time specific, especially if a student requires or needs extended time. This is extremely important to take into consideration when deciding if that accommodation, how you're going to properly administer or implement the accommodations. for the students. Here's a slide to sort of indicate the varying unit times and how it increases complexity for scheduling. And there are other things to consider. I won't spend too much time on this, but I did want to speak to it just in terms of thinking about, we talk about accommodations, we talk about what they are and how they're appropriate to provide to students, but please consider these other factors when providing them, because it is pretty complex. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Bonnie O'Keefe, to do a live demo of the student registration and personal needs profile.
Great, thanks, Lanisha. So some of you have no doubt seen me do some version of this before. I'm going to try and tailor it today to things you might be doing for your English learner students in terms of checking off their PNPs. So if you didn't know already, the PARCC Personal Needs Profile, or PNP, is how we record the accessibility features and accommodations that every student gets. For computer-based tests, it turns on the accommodation so that the student has access to it. But for non-computer-based accommodations, what it does is just like back in the days of the DC CAS, where you would mark down what accommodation a student received on the test booklet itself. In PARCC, we record it on the PNP. Something new this year, you might remember last year that the student registration files and the PNP were separate, and we had two separate test administrations. This year for PARCC, it's one test administration, so no more PBA versus EOY, and it's one file. So student registration and PNP have been consolidated together, which I'm sure is making the data folks in your building a little bit happier. But basically what it means is that you no longer have to make sure that you're registering students for a test one way and then you're giving them accommodations another way. It's all together in one file. And that's all managed at dc.pearsonaccessnext.com. Sorry about that .org. That's an error there, but we can fix that. So OSSE has uploaded initial student registration for LEAs, and from here on out, it's your responsibility to fill in accommodations and accessibility feature information, or to add students as they might arrive at your school and keep things up to date. One of the most frequently asked questions we get is, when is the PNP due? When is the PNP due? So because the PNP is really a recording of the accommodations a student needs, it can be edited right up until the day of administration if need be. However, we strongly recommend that you start early, that you start now thinking about what your students may need, because it will affect your test plan, your logistics plan, your staffing plan. So it's good to start thinking now for all your students, especially for EL students, since the IEP and SEDS can really draw out the time for implementation for students with disabilities. But if you haven't started thinking critically about your EL plans and how those will translate into testing, I would say now is the time to do so. As a general recommendation, if you're administering any accommodations on paper, plan to order those a few weeks in advance, no later than 5 business days before you need them. And it's usually a good idea to lock down your PNP and have all your accommodations plans in place about 3 weeks prior to the start of the assessment. So we're going to go to dc.pearsonaccessnext.com. I'm actually going to go to the training site, which is trng.pearsonaccessnext.com. For your reference, we're also going to post this PowerPoint slide deck on our website, so we have some screenshots here for you to take a look at. In the meantime, I'm going to switch over to Chrome. So we're here on Pearson Access Next, the training site, trng.pearsonaccessnext.com. So if we sign in here, I've created a sample student and sample school that I'm going to log into. So I'm going to go to Setup and Students. And I've got these two sample students who happen to have the same name as me here. And under Manage Student Tests, that is the choice you'll choose if you're a special ed person or an EL person who needs to go in and add accommodations for a student. That's where you'd go. And you'll see here this student has been assigned the 8th grade ELA and 8th grade math test. So you manage these accommodations separately for each test. 8th grade, you'll also have a science test at some point because that's given on 5, 8, and once in high school. The reason we manage the accommodations separately for each test is because different things are available for each test, first of all, and second of all, different things might be appropriate for each test. So, for example, obviously, you wouldn't need a calculator accommodation for the ELA test. And maybe based on the student themselves, there are certain things, certain strengths or weaknesses they have where it might be appropriate to have one accommodation somewhere and a different accommodation somewhere else, depending on that student's needs. So, for instance, if this were an EL student, under here, we see accommodations for English learners as a whole separate category. So this is where you'd go. You'd check off this box if the student was getting an accommodation as an EL student. So that tells us there's some overlap between what's available to students with disabilities versus what's available to students who are English learners. And so that tells us that this student is getting the accommodations as an English learner. Translation into the mathematics assessment into Spanish, you would choose that here, and that would assign the Spanish test to the student, whether they were getting it on paper or online. Administration directions read aloud in students' native language. You'll see here that there are 10 different native languages to choose from that are available, and you can find the translated directions on parcc.pearson.com. Administration directions clarified in students' native language. That's something you can choose for the student, and word-to-word dictionary. And then down here, we have that overlap category. So for instance, extended time could be granted for an EL student, a 504 IEP student, or both. So all these students could potentially get extended time, but we'd like you to document why they are getting the extended time so we can sort that out. And that'll help us make the data more useful as well from the test, so we can say, you know, EL students with extended time performed like this. And finally, text-to-speech human reader, human signer, particularly for the math assessment for ELs, is available. So if you have a student who might be most appropriate for them to take the math assessment in English, but it could be helpful for them to have it read aloud to them in English. That's available. One thing that's not available that I do want to point out to folks, we did have some confusion on this last year. You can't mix languages. So you can't have a Spanish math test with an English read aloud, or an English math test but have Spanish text-to-speech turned on. That's not an option. So it's sort of all one language or the other. I think with that, I'll wrap up my little mini PNP demo with the plug that on our webinar next Monday, the 29th, we'll really be going into some nitty-gritty bits and pieces of the PNP and addressing some issues like the one I just flagged where people got thrown off last year. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Lanisha.
So I'm going to speak a little bit about science and just mention that there are some new things that you need to be aware of. There are 2 parts to a test per grade. Each part is timed for 1 hour. There are 4 different forms per grade, and then there is flexibility to test each part on separate days. and CO codes are required. There are some important dates that you should be aware of for science. There's a test administration webinar coming up on April 4th, and there will be further outreach around when we get closer to April around the test ordering, student registration, and all of that. And lastly, the test window opens on May 2nd. Did want to take a moment to mention accessibility and accommodations for WIDA access for ELLs 2.0. There are web-based training requirements for WIDA access. I definitely want to make sure that folks are aware of this information, just so that you can go and do the test-based test to complete the quiz. Test administrators must pass all web-based quizzes with a score of 80% or higher and receive a training certificate. If you click this hyperlink here, you will be able to go to the WIDA Access for ELL site and complete the training course. And this is just a screenshot of what it will look like for you to go and complete it. As many of you know, today is the deadline for roster validation, and the test window for access opens on April 25th. I want to take a moment to talk about who takes the access for ELLs. Students in the following groups must take the assessment until they exit English learner status by scoring a 5 or above on the WIDA composite proficiency level. All students in grades K through 12 who have been identified as an English learner, and all first grade students who took kindergarten access placement tests and scored as a fluent English speaker, and students whose parents opt them out of services, they still must take WIDA access. There were some questions in the chat box about whether or not students who are exited out of, so students who receive a 5.0 or higher on WIDA access, if they are eligible for accommodations listed in part 2 of our manual. And I do want to say that they are eligible for accommodations for English language learners appropriate to their advanced level. And this accommodations and accessibility slide is specific only to WIDA access for ELLs. There are 3 accommodations that must be based on students' IEP or 504 plans to be activated within the WIDA access system. And this information, I just want to make sure I have this placeholder here, but there is additional information coming around how do we assign the appropriate accommodations for students who fall into both categories. This is a screenshot of a checklist that you may use. That's a great resource to document the accommodations for them. And I do want to plug that there will be a crosswalk that will be posted soon on our OSSE.DC testing accommodation site. And like other testing accommodations crosswalks, this resource document will compare accommodations available for selection in SEDS to its equivalent accommodation, accessibility feature, or administration consideration on each content-specific statewide assessment and the WIDA access for ELLs 2.0. I'll pause at this moment to review the chat box and see if there are any questions that I can address before I transition to mentioning resources that are available. Just the US question.
Hey everybody, this is Bonnie jumping in again. So a couple questions from the chat box we did want to address. One that we get frequently is about students who are new to the country and who may or may not be eligible to not take the ELA assessment. So that policy really hasn't changed from the days of CAS, so that's one thing that hasn't changed in the assessment world. The policy is that if a student is new to the United States within the past 12 calendar months, they may be excused from taking the ELA assessment if they take access. So for that 1 year, they may be excused from taking PARCC ELA as long as they take access. And of course, access is required for all ELLs, so it shouldn't be a question that they take access. Students who fall into this category may take ELA if the school wants to use that data and if the school wants to administer the test to that student, but it will not be counted for accountability. Those students do have to take math, they do have to take science. So those are the rules around students who are new to US. And in terms of documentation, we do a big sort of assessment data verification process after testing happens, but before reporting to make sure that everything is correct. And one of the things we do ask LEAs to double check is students new to US status. So we make sure that we are counting students as participants appropriately if they don't have an ELA score. The other question we got, which I did answer towards everybody, was about who's eligible for text-to-speech or read aloud. So I know this one can get a little confusing. So for math, text-to-speech read aloud is available to everybody. So you can give students text-to-speech for math if they're EL, if they're students with disabilities, or if they're just students you think would benefit from that. One thing I would caution against is, as with any accessibility feature, you should really be making that determination on an individual basis. We really wouldn't recommend giving blanket text-to-speech for everybody on the math assessment, simply because it might not be beneficial for all students. It does take a lot of time to have the test read aloud to you if you don't also have an extended time accommodation. And it's sort of just one more thing on the computer platform that could throw off students or distract them. So on math only, that is available to everybody, but those are just a couple notes of caution there. For ELA and for science, the read aloud, the text-to-speech, whatever form it takes, is only available for students with disabilities. So if you have an EL student who's also a student with disability and read aloud is noted on their IEP, they can of course do that. But for ELA and science, those are accommodations and not available to all students. So I hope we've answered those questions, and we'll try and circle back at the end about questions if anything's unclear, but we'll go through some resources so you can take the information from this webinar and circle back and get any more information you need, because there are a ton of resources out there and we want to make sure you know where to find them.
Great. So the first resource that I'd like to point you to, or set of resources, is here on the OSSE Assessment Accommodations website. I mentioned this website before, but this is the place where you would go to access our part 1 and 2 of our manuals, the webinar series that we're holding, the recording is housed there, any of the crosswalks, and just general information around how to implement accommodations and be aware of other assessment-related items. There are also PARCC-specific resources. PARCC.pearson.com offers accommodations practice tutorials. There is also a very comprehensive accessibility features and accommodations manual and implementation guidance, the training modules, and lastly, dc.pearsonaccessnext.com. please make sure that you have your user name and password to log in. That's extremely important. And one thing to note about the accessibility features and accommodations manual is that it has a new format focused on before, during, and after testing implementation. This is a very useful format because it will provide key details, whereas in the crosswalks we quickly mention and make reference to what the accommodations are and general information. This PARCC manual goes into a lot more detail. There are also tutorials that students and you all should practice prior to implementing these accommodations. And this is the screenshot of what it looks like when you go on the website. These tutorials are very informative and very helpful. Now I'm going to take a couple of minutes to allow you to type in any questions you may have in the chat box. And what we'll do is spend about 3 minutes waiting for questions to appear here and then answer them.
Hey everybody, so we're back to answer a couple questions that have come in. One question is about, if you have students who don't speak one of those 10 languages that are listed and provided in accommodations directions, or if you don't have a student who speaks Spanish. So we know that we have hundreds of languages spoken by students in DC, several of them specific to DC that aren't so prevalent in the PARCC consortium as a whole. So if you have a student who speaks a language that is not listed on that drop-down and not provided in translation for the administrative directions, clarification of administrative directions in a student's native language is available. So if you have students who speak a language like Amharic, who it's not listed in the dropdown, not provided for administrative directions, meaning at the beginning of the test when you're saying, hello, welcome, you're about to take PARCC, blah, 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 you can clarify those directions in the student's native language to make sure that the student understands what you're asking him or her to do. However, ad hoc translation of the actual test content is not allowed in any language, and that's a test validity issue. So unfortunately, that's not something we can offer or allow. The only trans adaptation of the actual test content that's available is in Spanish. Someone asked about one-on-one assistance. If you're an LEA person, please do come to our office hours. Those are great places to get one-on-one questions answered. You know, you can follow up with Lanisha or myself via email if you have sort of one-off questions. We're here to support you. But the office hours are a great place to come and, you know, work on your PMP, work on your planning, and if you hit any roadblocks, we'll be there to help you. So the next one coming up is this Friday, the 29th from 3 to 5 p.m. We're actually, it was originally scheduled for Thursday, but we're moving in. We're going to send out an email about that later today. But please be aware that this Friday, 3 to 5 p.m. at OSSE, and the rest of the office hours schedules on our website, but we'll basically be doing them first bi-weekly and then on a weekly basis, moving up to testing. So do take advantage of those to get some one-on-one support. So someone had a question about the text-to-speech accommodation for math. Is it a voice on the computer or a person administering the test? So if you have a student who needs the test read aloud to them, it can take either form. So you can take the computer-based test for PARCC and get the computer to read to you. That's called text-to-speech. You can also have a human reader with a computer-based accommodation, or a human reader with a paper-based test. So all three of those are available for PARCC ELA and PARCC Math. There's something else available for science. That's one of the things we're planning to go into the nitty-gritty of on our PMP webinar next week, because it's not something that just applies to ELLs students. It's something that everyone needs to be aware of. But yes, there are several different forms that having the questions in an audio format can take. What I was saying earlier about ELL students and accountability, that is only for students who are new to the US in the past 12 months. If they take the ELA test, it will not count for accountability. If you have a student who has been in the US for 13 months, they must take the ELA test, and it will count for accountability. It has nothing to do with the student's level of English language proficiency. It is just a provision for students who are new to the country in the past 12 months with regards to their ELA assessments. So they do not have to take the ELA test if they are new to the country, English learners within the past 12 months. 12 months, 5 days, have to take the ELA test. I hope that clarifies for folks a little bit. And that is the end of all the questions we've got. So we'll let you all early, call this a day, and we do want to give you some follow-up and contact information. So please be aware, in addition to webinar part 3 coming up next Monday, there's also a DC Science Test Administration webinar on April 4th. I know that's a little ways away, but do mark your calendars for that. We'll be posting the slide deck from this webinar and the recording on our website here. You can reach out to our general assessment box for any general questions. You can mark your calendar for our office hours, and you can contact Lanisha and myself, and our emails are below. And we will sign off now, but we'll leave these up on the screen for a couple minutes just so you can note them down if needed. But all of this will go on our website shortly. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.